The old Dodge looked ready for the scrapyard, faded paint peeling at the edges like sunburned skin, doors eaten through with rust the color of dried blood, the engine coughing and rattling every morning like something half alive and begging to be put down for good. Every worker in the parking lot laughed when the janitor refused to sell it for scrap. "That junk belongs in a crusher," one mechanic sneered, slapping the hood hard enough to leave a dent, then walking away without looking back. But 38-year-old Elias only tightened his grip on the keys. What nobody knew was that hidden beneath decades of grime and grease and silence sat a factory stamp almost no collector had seen in 30 years. And when a 35-year-old luxury car collector stepped out of her Aston Martin, crossed the parking lot, and froze completely still beside the old Dodge, the entire garage went quiet in a way that none of them could explain yet. Elias Morrow had worked at Hartfield Premium Auto on the western edge of Chicago's suburbs for 15 years, 3 months, and 11 days, not that anyone was counting, least of all the men who stepped past him every morning without a word. He came in before sunrise, left after dark, and in between he mopped floors, emptied oil drums, cleaned the bathrooms no one else wanted to touch, and kept the kind of silence that other people mistook for stupidity. The garage specialized in European luxury, Porsche, Bentley, the occasional Lamborghini whose owner would stand near it while it was being serviced as if afraid someone might forget it was his. The mechanics wore clean uniforms and made decent money. The service advisors wore pressed shirts and spoke with the careful confidence of men who had never had to beg for anything. And then there was Elias, pushing a mop through the same corridor for the 273rd time, breathing in the smell of premium synthetic motor oil and someone else's ambition. The Dodge had belonged to his father. That was the only explanation Elias ever gave, and he gave it rarely, only when someone pushed hard enough and rudely enough to deserve even that much. It was a 1969 Dodge, a year and model that would have meant something once, might have turned heads at a stoplight in another lifetime, but which now arrived in the Hartfield parking lot every weekday morning, looking like an insult to every gleaming machine around it. Marcus Webb, the shop's senior mechanic, had given it a nickname within the first week: the Zombie. Not because it was undead in any romantic sense, but because he thought it was disgusting that it kept moving. "That thing should have been buried a decade ago," he would say, and the other mechanics would laugh the way men laugh when they want to make sure the person being laughed at can hear them clearly. Danny Cho, who ran the service desk and drove a leased BMW he couldn't really afford, called it the rolling garbage can. He said it with a wide smile, the kind of smile that was never actually happy about anything. The owner of the garage, a man named Gerald Hartfield, 62 years old, thick through the shoulders and thinner through the conscience, had approached Elias twice in the last year about selling the car for scrap. The first time he offered $300. The second time he raised it to $500, as though the additional $200 were a gesture of extraordinary generosity. "I'll have someone haul it off. You'll never have to look at it again," Gerald had said. And Elias had looked at him for a long moment before saying, very quietly, "I don't want it gone." Gerald had shrugged and walked away, muttering something under his breath that Elias chose not to hear. The morning everything changed started like every other. Gray sky pressing down over the suburbs, a cold that came off Lake Michigan and moved through wool like it was nothing, the parking lot shining with the previous night's rain. Elias arrived at 6:45. Parked the Dodge in the far corner where it always went away from the good cars, tucked against the chain-link fence where the light barely reached. He had almost reached the side entrance when Marcus called out from the bay doors. "Hey, Morrow, you know that thing failed its emissions last year, right? City's gonna flag it eventually." Elias kept walking. "Just saying," Marcus added. "Louder now. Some things know when it's time to quit." He was halfway through mopping the second bay when the Aston Martin pulled in. It was a DBS Volante in a shade of midnight blue, so dark it looked black until the light caught it right. And then it glowed like deep water. The woman who stepped out of it wore a camel coat and moved through the parking lot with the kind of deliberate calm that made everyone else look rushed by comparison. Vivienne Hart was 35 years old and had spent the better part of 12 years building a reputation in a world that most people did not know existed, the world of serious vintage automobile acquisition. Not collectors who bought restored show cars and took photographs beside them. Serious acquisition. Provenance research. Factory documentation. authentication disputes, the kind of work that required knowing not just what a car was worth, but what it meant, where it had been, who had touched it, and why any of that should matter to anyone. She had clients in 8 countries. She had turned down more offers than most people in that garage would see in 3 lifetimes. She was not the kind of woman who froze when she looked at something, but she froze when she looked at the Dodge. It happened in the space between one step and the next. Her right foot came down on the wet asphalt. Her eyes swept across the lot in the habitual way of someone who is always cataloging without meaning to, and then stopped. Her body stopped. Not dramatically, not with a gasp or a hand to the mouth, just a complete, absolute stillness, the way a hunting dog goes rigid when it catches a scent it did not expect. From inside the bay, Marcus noticed and nudged Danny. "She's looking at the zombie," he said, and they both laughed. Vivienne did not react. She walked toward the Dodge slowly, her eyes moving across it, the way someone reads a text in a language they only half remember, reaching for something. Not sure yet if it is there. She walked the full circumference of the car twice before she said anything. She crouched near the passenger rear door and examined the hinge plate. She ran a finger along the bottom of the door frame, came up with 30 years of grime on her fingertip, and studied it with no visible emotion. She looked at the roofline. She looked at the windshield molding. She looked at the door handles, an original set, cast in a particular style used for only 2 production years, and even within those 2 years, altered mid-run. These were pre-alteration, the kind of detail that meant nothing to most people, and everything to the kind of person Vivienne was. Marcus wandered out from the bay with his arms crossed, wearing the expression of a man who expects to be entertained. "Don't tell me you actually like that thing," he said. Vivienne glanced at him once, briefly, and looked back at the car. "Who owns this?" she asked. Nobody answered immediately. Then Gerald emerged from the office side door, tucking in his shirt, sensing money the way he always did, some animal instinct that had served him well enough in business if not in character. "I own the property," he said. "The car belongs to one of my employees." Vivienne stood up and looked directly at Elias, who had appeared in the bay doorway holding his mop and saying nothing. "Is this yours?" she asked. "Yes," Elias said. "Have you ever had the body panels replaced?" she asked. He shook his head. "Any part of the frame?" Another shake. She looked back at the car, then at him, and her expression had changed in some way that was hard to name. It was not excitement exactly. It was the look of someone doing rapid calculations and not yet willing to trust the result. "I'd like to see under the hood," she said. It was not quite a request. Elias set down the mop. He walked to the car, unlocked its actual key. No remote. The lock cylinder worn smooth with 15 years of daily use, and pulled the hood release. The hood groaned as it came up, a sound of compressed time, and the smell that came out was old oil and rubber and something deeper, almost mineral. The engine beneath was not clean. It was not restored. It was original in the way that a fossil is original, preserved by neglect, by the specific conditions of its environment, by the fact that no one had ever cared enough to tamper with it. Vivienne took a small flashlight from her coat pocket. She always carried one, the way a doctor always carries something to write with, and leaned in over the engine bay. The mechanics watched. Gerald watched. Elias stood with his hands at his sides and watched Vivienne's face, not the engine. She moved the light slowly. Past the carburetor, past the valve covers, down toward the firewall, into the shadow where the engine met the bulk of the car's body. Where most people never looked, because there was nothing to see there except metal and time. And then she stopped moving. The flashlight held steady. Her breathing, which had been even and controlled, changed slightly, not much. Just a fraction. Just enough for Elias to notice, and for none of the mechanics to. She stayed in that position for what felt like a very long time. Then she straightened up. She clicked off the flashlight and put it back in her pocket. She turned to look at Elias with an expression that had become absolutely neutral, in the way that things become neutral when they are working very hard at it. "There is a factory stamp on the firewall," she said. "Down near the lower left. It is partially obscured by oil deposit, but it is there." She paused. "If it is what I think it is, This is one of the Challenger prototype variants from the Advanced Development Program, a limited-run series of which fewer than a dozen units were ever completed before the program was terminated. Most of the vehicles produced under that program were scrapped by the factory. The ones that left the facility were not supposed to. Marcus had been leaning against the bay door frame. He laughed a short, sharp sound. So what, he said, a little stamp makes a heap like this valuable. Vivienne looked at him with the patience of someone who has explained complicated things to uncomprehending people many times and has made peace with it. If the stamp is authentic and the provenance holds, she said, this vehicle is worth considerably more than this entire property. The silence that followed was the kind that changes the air pressure in a room. Gerald was the first to move. He stepped forward with the energy of a man who has just spotted something on the ground that might be money. Now, hang on, he said. I've been trying to buy this car for, it's not for sale, Elias said. The words came out quietly, but with a finality that made Gerald stop walking. I'm just saying, Gerald continued. If we're talking about a real valuation situation here, I think we should discuss. It is not for sale, Elias said again. Gerald looked at him the way he always looked at Elias, with the particular frustration of a man who cannot understand why someone beneath him is not simply complying. Then he turned to Vivienne. What are we talking about here? Give me a ballpark. Vivienne did not give him anything. She looked at Elias. I would like to arrange for a formal authentication examination, she said. At your convenience. You retain full ownership throughout. I am asking only to document what is there. Elias looked at her for a long time. All right, he said. Over the next 2 hours, Gerald made 3 increasingly frantic offers. $5,000. Then $15,000. Then, when Vivienne had moved her Aston Martin to block the far corner of the lot and was crouched by the Dodge's rear quarter panel taking notes in a leather-bound notebook, he pulled Elias aside and said, $40,000, cash, today. Elias told him no each time with the same even voice and the same absence of anger, which seemed to bother Gerald far more than anger would have. Gerald was a man who understood negotiation as a language, with a limited vocabulary, numbers going up, resistance going down, a transaction eventually occurring, and Elias was not speaking that language at all, which left Gerald with no grammar for the conversation. He tried a different approach. He talked about practical matters, about the city's emissions requirements, about the cost of insuring a vehicle with no verified market value, about the liability of keeping an unregistered mechanical hazard in his parking lot. Elias listened to all of it with the patience of a man who has spent 15 years listening to things that were not his problem, being framed as his problem. Then he said no again. Gerald went back to his office and closed the door with more force than the situation strictly required. The mechanics, who had spent years making the zombie a reliable source of entertainment, went quiet in a different way, now the quiet of men who are recalculating. Marcus cleaned the same wrench 3 times without noticing. Danny Cho kept finding reasons to come out to the service lot and look at the Dodge as if hoping it might confess something if he stared long enough. The jokes had stopped without anyone deciding to stop them. They had simply become unavailable, like punchlines that no longer land after you understand the setup differently. A younger mechanic named Troy managed to get his phone out and was framing up a shot of the firewall stamp when Vivienne stepped between him and the car without looking up from her notebook. Please don't do that, she said, pleasantly but completely. Troy put his phone away. Later that afternoon, when the lot had emptied and the overhead lights were buzzing in the early dark of a Chicago autumn evening, Elias sat in the driver's seat of the Dodge and held the steering wheel the way he had held it 10,000 times before. He told Vivienne, who was leaning against the passenger door, notes complete, flashlight back in her coat, about his father. About Raymond Morrow, who had worked with his hands his whole life and spoken very little and shown up every day to things that other people had abandoned. About how Raymond had kept the Dodge in a rented storage unit for 11 years before Elias was old enough to drive. And how, when he handed over the keys, he said, "Don't ever sell it to someone who only sees the price." Elias had been 22 then. He had thought his father was being sentimental. He had not understood yet that some men see things more clearly than they can explain them. He went home that night at 8, ate the same dinner he ate most nights, rice, beans, whatever was on sale at the grocery near his apartment, and sat in the single chair he owned, that was comfortable enough for sitting in the dark thinking about things. His apartment was on the third floor of a building that had been built in the 70s and updated only in the ways required by law. The walls were thin enough to hear his neighbor's television, his mother's medical bills, the ongoing ones, the ones that followed a stroke with the patience of something that does not need to hurry, were in a folder on the kitchen table. He had been managing them for 3 years, chipping away at what felt like a wall built from compound interest and misfortune. $500,000 would not just clear the bills. $500,000 would rebuild the floor his life was standing on. He was thinking about this at 11:47 when his phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. Side door, garage, now. He sat with it for a moment, then put on his coat. He smelled it before he saw it. The particular wrongness of a space that has been entered by people who did not belong in it, something disturbed in the quality of the air, a chemical sharpness, the faint echo of movement, recently stopped. The side door glass was broken in the lower panel. The frame around it bent at an angle that required force. Inside, the bay was dim. The overhead fluorescence had been cut at the breaker, which told him whoever had come in knew the layout well enough to find the panel, which meant they had either been in the building before or had been given information by someone who had. Elias moved to the far corner by instinct and found the Dodge with its hood up, the latch forced, the interior light on. Someone had been in the car. The glove compartment was open. Papers from the original owner's manual, which Elias had kept there since he inherited the car, were spread across the passenger seat, a small evidence of desperate searching. The carpet under the dash had been pulled up, the sun visors flipped down, the space behind the rear seat probed with something that had left scratches in the vinyl. They had been thorough. They had also, it appeared, been interrupted. A phone lay on the floor near the passenger door, cracked across the screen, dropped in someone's hurry to leave. And though the intruders were gone, the sound of running feet on wet asphalt had barely finished echoing when Vivian's headlights swung into the lot. She had been parked down the block. She had anticipated this. "I should have told you sooner," she said, standing at the hood, with her flashlight on the firewall. Once word starts moving in the collector community, it moves very fast, and it does not always move through ethical people. The stamp was still there. Whatever they had photographed, they had not been able to touch it. "So, they have an image," Elias said. "Yes," Vivian said, "which means people who have been looking for a vehicle like this for a long time now believe it may have been found." She turned the flashlight off. The bay was very dark and very quiet. These were not casual opportunists, she added. The way the interior was searched, they knew what they were looking for. They knew where to look. Someone with real knowledge sent them. Elias was quiet for a moment. The garage smelled like cold concrete and old grease, and something that might have been fear. "I just wanted to be left alone," he said. It was not a complaint. It was a statement of fact about the life he had built with some care, and which was now being taken apart from the outside. Vivienne looked at him with something that was not quite sympathy, because she was not the kind of person who offered sympathy easily, but was the closest she usually came to it. "I know," she said, "but you're holding something that a great many people have been looking for 30 years. And some of them do not respect the distinction between wanting something and taking it." The call came the next morning at 7:14. An international dialing code Elias didn't recognize. A man with a smooth voice and an accent that placed him somewhere in the mid-Atlantic corridor, the voice of someone who had carefully assembled himself from expensive components. He represented an acquisitions firm, he said, that specialized in automotive provenance assets. He had become aware, through professional channels, of a vehicle matching a particular historical profile. He was prepared to offer, pending physical confirmation, $500,000. Cash. Immediate transfer. No public record. Elias could live his entire remaining life differently beginning this week. The man said this last part, with the gentleness of someone who has learned that kindness is more effective than pressure. At least, at the beginning. Elias said he would think about it, and ended the call. His friend Darren, who worked at a tire shop off the interstate, and was the closest thing Elias had to someone he talked to about personal things, said, "Sell it before someone just takes it." His neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, said the same thing. Though she knew nothing about cars and was mainly responding to the word 500,000 the way most people respond to large numbers, which is to say with immediate and unconditional enthusiasm. His mother, when he visited her that afternoon in the care facility where she spent her days in a room that smelled of institutional cleaner and begonias, she could not tend herself, did not say anything. She held his hand and looked at him with the eyes of someone who has already given all her advice and knows her son well enough to understand when he is still deciding. Vivienne, when he told her about the call, did not say sell or don't sell. She said, "A serious buyer does not make that offer before authentication. A serious buyer waits for verification because they need to protect their investment. This offer was made specifically to move you before you fully understand what you have." She had spent the previous day running title searches through 3 databases. The Dodge had a documented registration history for the first 4 years of its life, a fleet address in Detroit, consistent with company assignment, then a private transfer that matched no standard sale record, then nothing, for 28 years, until Raymond Morrow's name appeared on a registration in southern Illinois in the late 90s. 28 years in which the car had officially not existed. Elias sat with that for a moment. "My father never talked about where he got it," he said. "Fathers sometimes protect their children from complicated things," Vivienne said. She was looking at the Dodge, which was parked in Vivienne's private lot now, inside a secured bay. The broken side door of the Hartfield garage having been sufficient to make the case for moving it. "I think," she said carefully, "that there may be more to find." There was more to find. It was in the trunk in a compartment beneath the spare tire that was not part of the standard factory configuration but had been added with the same level of care as the rest of the car's original assembly, which suggested it had been done by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Vivienne found it on the 3rd day, when she was doing a full mechanical documentation. A metal lockbox, not locked, the lock long since rusted open, containing a manila envelope with the flap gummed shut by decades of ambient humidity. Inside, a fold of papers, photographs, and a letter, handwritten on the stationery of a company that had ceased to exist in 1974. The engineer's name was Walter Crane. He had worked in Dodge's Advanced Development Division from 1966 to 1973, and had been, according to the fragments of internal documentation that survived him, the primary architect of what the program called the Apex series, a sequence of experimental high-performance variants that were never intended for production, but were built in very small numbers to test theoretical performance, the configurations that the company was not yet ready to commit to publicly. The Apex vehicles were, by most accounts Vivienne had been able to locate, extraordinary machines not in the way of show cars built for exhibition, but in the way of things designed to do something specific, and doing it with a precision that no amount of later refinement has entirely replicated. The engineers who worked alongside Crane, and who were still alive to be interviewed, 2 of them, both in their late 80s, both living in retirement in the Midwest, described the program with the specific reverence that old craftsmen use when talking about work that no one will ever be able to do again exactly that way. One of them, when Vivienne spoke with him by phone, was silent for a long time after she described the vehicle. Then he said, very quietly, "I didn't think any of them made it, and they were almost entirely gone, dismantled, repurposed, or crushed when the program was terminated in the budget restructuring of 1973. Walter Crane had retired in obscurity, moved to a small town in downstate Illinois, and died in 2004. He had had no children. He had not given interviews. He had, it seemed, carried the memory of the Apex program with him into silence and kept it there, except for this, except for the car. The letter was addressed to no one specific. It was written in the careful, unshowy handwriting of a man who had spent his life writing technical documentation and had never learned to be florid about personal things. It said, in part, that the vehicle had been given to a trusted friend, a man who understood that some things are built for reasons beyond profit, that the engineer wanted it preserved in the hands of someone who would not see it only as a transaction. It said that the car represented, in the engineer's view, not just an engineering achievement but a certain kind of faith. Faith that quality existed independently of whether anyone recognized it, that doing something right had value even when no one was watching. And at the end, in a handwriting slightly less steady than the rest, as though written at a different time or in a different mood. If someone finds this, who still understands what it meant to make something that mattered, let it live. Elias read the letter twice, standing in the bay. Then he folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope and set it on the workbench. He did not say anything for a while. Vivian waited. And the waiting was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that forms naturally around something important, the way water forms around a stone. The sound of traffic came through the corrugated walls, muted and regular. Somewhere outside, the city continued its business with perfect indifference. He knew, Elias finally said. Not loudly, not with drama, just a quiet recognition. My father knew what it was, and he kept it anyway. Not because of what it was worth, because of what it meant to Walter. He paused. He was that kind of man. Vivian looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. And she meant something more precise than sympathy. The news, as these things do, traveled faster than either of them could have stopped if they had tried. The image that had been taken of the firewall stamp made its way through private collector channels within 48 hours of the break-in, and within a week, it had been authenticated by two independent experts who did not know each other and arrived at the same conclusion without prompting. The stamp was consistent with factory original Apex series production markings, a classification that had been theoretical in collector circles for most of 3 decades, because no verified survivor vehicle had ever been confirmed. The response was immediate and not entirely civilized. The bidding started privately, which in the world Vivienne moved through meant it started through intermediaries and encrypted messages and phone calls that did not record themselves. 700,000, then 850. Then, when the word got fully out, and the people who had been looking the longest started arriving. 1 million. 1.4 million. 1.8. A collector from the Gulf who had been after Apex documentation for 15 years sent a representative to Chicago with authorization to go to 2.5. A technology executive who had recently discovered automotive history, the way wealthy men in their 50s sometimes discover new hobbies, with total commitment and no respect for process, sent an offer of $3 million through an attorney, without having seen the car in person. This particular man, whose name was in the news regularly for reasons unrelated to cars, also sent a personal note with his attorney's letter, a handwritten few lines about his deep passion for American automotive heritage that managed to convey the opposite of everything it intended. Vivienne filed both documents and said nothing. Gerald Hartfield, when he heard the numbers that were being discussed, sat down in his office chair and did not get up for a long time. He thought about the $300 he had offered for scrap. He thought about the $500. He thought about $40,000. Cash, today, and how Elias had said no in that quiet, flat voice. And he found that he could not sit still with the memory of his own certainty. He was not a man who experienced regret, easily regret, required a kind of self-examination that his particular confidence had always protected him from. But he sat in his chair for a long time and felt something that was in the general neighborhood of it. There was also a collector who came in person, a man named Franklin Bauer, 60 years old, silver-haired. The kind of wealth that is old enough to have become invisible. He simply appeared one morning at the address Vivienne had never given him, which meant he had ways of finding things that did not depend on being told them. He was polite. He was knowledgeable, genuinely knowledgeable, the kind that Vivienne recognized immediately as the real article, a man who had been serious about this for decades and not just recently. He made his case calmly and well. The car would be maintained perfectly, displayed privately but available to scholars, properly preserved in conditions she could verify. He offered a figure that he delivered without hesitation, 2.8 million, cash. His own name, on no documents, if Elias preferred it that way. He looked at Elias when he spoke, and not at Vivienne, which was either respect or strategy, and possibly both. Elias listened to all of it. Then he said he would think about it. Bauer nodded, left a card, and walked out to a car that cost more than Elias's building. Elias looked at the card for a moment, then set it face down on the workbench. I don't want to think about it, he told Vivienne quietly. I know, she said. But you should anyway. Elias received all offers through Vivienne. who received them with the professional courtesy of someone who is not moved by numbers that would destroy most people. She presented each one to Elias with the relevant context and no recommendation. He listened. He was not unmoved by the numbers. He was a man with a sick mother and a thin bank account, and a job that paid him what it paid him, and he was not so disconnected from reality as to pretend that the gap between his life and what those numbers represented was not enormous. But he was also a man who had grown up watching his father hold a thing and refused to let go of it for reasons other people couldn't understand, and some things that fathers do make deep grooves in their children without anyone naming them. The exhibitor from the Midwest Automotive Heritage Exhibition reached out to Vivienne in the third week. The show was the largest vintage automobile gathering in the region, 4 days in a convention center west of the city, attended by enthusiasts and historians and serious collectors from across the country, with a documentary press corps and a judging panel whose opinions carried actual weight in the market. They had a slot for the Dodge, if Elias wanted it. Center Hall. Main stage lighting. The full treatment. He said yes before Vivienne finished explaining the offer. He drove it to the show himself. This was not what anyone expected. They expected the car to arrive on a trailer, cushioned and covered, the way serious show vehicles travel. What arrived instead was the Dodge, under its own power, at 6 in the morning on the first day of the exhibition. Elias behind the wheel in his work clothes, the ones he wore to the Hartfield garage, the ones that had the small Hartfield logo on the breast pocket that someone had never asked his permission to put there. He had not planned the work clothes as a statement. He wore them because they were what he had, and he was not in the habit of performing things he did not feel. The drive-in had been 40 minutes on the expressway. The Dodge running in the way it always ran, not smoothly, not quietly, but consistently, with the particular insistence of something that has decided not to stop, and in those 40 minutes, in the gray 6 o'clock light of a Midwestern morning, Elias had found himself thinking about his father again, about Raymond in this same seat, and had understood something that had been nearby for a long time, but not quite reachable, that his father had not kept the car because he thought it was valuable. He had kept it because Walter Crane had trusted him with it. And Raymond Morrow was exactly the kind of man who did not put down something he had been trusted to carry. The engine noise in the parking structure made people stop and turn. It was a big sound, old and rough, nothing synthetic about it. The sound of metal and combustion and decades of stubborn mechanical life. People who were there to work stopped what they were doing to watch the old Dodge pull in. Nobody knew yet what it was. They just knew it sounded like something. By noon on the first day, the authentication panel had confirmed publicly what Vivienne had believed from the beginning. The factory stamp was original and intact. The vehicle serial sequence placed it within the confirmed Apex production window. The firewall assembly matched documented engineering specifications from the program's archived technical drawings, which had been located by a historian at the Automotive Library in Michigan, who had been quietly corresponding with Vivienne for 2 weeks. The frame was unmodified. The body panels were original. The car was, as far as any expert in the room could determine, the only confirmed surviving Apex variant in existence. The words "the only one" moved through the exhibition hall like a current. Cameras came out. People who had been walking past stopped and stayed. Collectors who had paid significant registration fees to display their own restored vehicles found themselves standing at the edge of a crowd, gathered around a car that had arrived under its own power, covered in original grime, driven by a man in work clothes who was standing quietly near the rear bumper with his hands in his pockets. Marcus Webb was there. He had come to the show for reasons he described to Danny as just curiosity, which was a lie he told himself so smoothly that he almost believed it. He stood at the back of the crowd and watched Elias stand beside the Dodge, while cameras flashed and experts spoke about provenance and historical significance, and the extraordinary circumstance of an Apex survivor in original condition. He watched the way people looked at the car, and then at Elias, with the kind of attention that people give to someone they have decided matters, and he remembered every joke he had made, every name he had used, every time he had slapped that hood and walked away confident in his own correct understanding of value. He remembered saying that junk belongs in a crusher, with the easy authority of a man who has never considered the possibility of being wrong about something he feels this certain about. He stood at the back and did not go forward. He felt something work its way through him that he would not have been able to name, and maybe did not want to. He drove home early and did not mention to anyone that he had gone. A journalist from an automotive history publication caught Elias near the back of the main hall during a break in the judging presentation. She was young and earnest, and asked her questions with the careful respect of someone who knew she was talking to a person, not a story. She asked about the factory stamp. She asked about the provenance. She asked about his father. And then she asked, "Are you going to sell it?" After everything, is this the thing that changes your life? Elias looked at her for a moment. Behind them, the Dodge sat under the exhibition lights, and the overhead lamps caught it in a way that made the original paint, not the faded version, the actual color beneath it, revealed here and there where the years had worn through differently, look like something still alive under the surface. "My father held on to this for 40 years, he said. He told me not to sell it to someone who only sees the price. I'm still trying to figure out what he meant by that exactly." He paused. "But I think I'm getting closer." Vivienne had been watching from across the hall for much of the afternoon. She had stood near the authentication table and answered questions from panel members and watched the room organize itself around the Dodge, the way rooms organize themselves around things that matter, a slow gravitational pull that brings people closer without any single person deciding to move. She had done this work for 12 years and had never felt it quite like this, not the discovery of a rare car, which happened, but the presence of a story that connected the rarest kind of thing to the rarest kind of person. She waited until the journalist moved on, and the crowd around the Dodge thinned slightly in the late afternoon. Then she walked to where Elias was standing. The show was winding toward its first-day close, the overhead lights shifting from harsh white to something warmer as the ambient light outside fell. The Dodge sat between them. "I want to make a proposal," she said. "Not a purchase. Not an offer with a number attached." She had spent a month thinking about how to say this correctly, and she was still not entirely satisfied with the words. "The vehicle belongs to you. That is not part of the conversation." She looked at the car. "What I want to propose is a partnership. A proper restoration done by people who know exactly what they're handling, who will treat every original element as the artifact it is, and when it's complete, placement in a permanent collection. Not locked away, not private. A public collection, with full attribution." She looked at him. "Your father's name on the display. Walter Crane's name. The whole story." Elias did not respond immediately. The hall was quieting around them, the day's voices fading into the distance. "Why?" he asked. It was a genuine question. "Because some things deserve to be preserved correctly," she said. "And because the story of how this car survived is as important as what the car is." She paused. "Your father made a choice that most people wouldn't have. He kept something alive that was supposed to be gone. That's worth remembering. The restoration took 4 months. Vivienne assembled a team 3 specialists, each responsible for a discrete system, and they worked in a temperature-controlled workshop in Milwaukee, documenting every step with photographs and written logs that would become part of the car's permanent provenance record. The original paint was not stripped but stabilized, the surface carefully consolidated so that the patina of its real history was preserved rather than erased. There were places on the body where the decades had worn through in layers, first the factory color, then a thin coat someone had applied in the 80s, then the oxidation that had followed, and those layers were treated as archaeological information, each one an honest record of the time the car had spent in the world. The engine, which had run reliably, if roughly for decades, was rebuilt using original specification components where they could be found and period-correct fabrications where they could not. And on the day they first turned it over in the restored configuration, the sound that came out of it was so clean and so deep and so correct that 2 of the mechanics stopped working and just listened for a moment, not saying anything, just receiving the sound the way you receive something you weren't sure you'd ever hear. The interior cracked vinyl, worn carpet, a steering wheel worn smooth in exactly the places 2 different men had held. It was conserved rather than replaced. The damage of time treated as information rather than defect. A conservator who specialized in historic upholstery spent 11 days on the front seat alone, stabilizing the vinyl so it would not continue to deteriorate, while also leaving intact every mark of use. The slight depression on the driver's side where Raymond Morrow had sat for decades, the wear pattern on the armrest that matched a particular way of holding your elbow when the window is down and the road is long and there is no hurry. The lockbox and its contents were professionally archived, the letter preserved between conservation-grade materials and photographed in high resolution for the permanent record. Walter Crane's handwriting. At the end, less steady than the rest, was reproduced in the exhibition materials exactly as written, because the unsteadiness was part of what it said. The day of the public unveiling was a Tuesday in early spring, when the light through the museum's tall windows was the particular pale gold of a morning that does not yet know it is going to be beautiful. The exhibition space was not large. It was a gallery within a larger institution, the kind of room where the objects on display are expected to carry their own weight and do not need theatrical help. The Dodge sat in the center of the room on a low platform, surrounded by space. The restoration had not made it look new. It had made it look exactly what it was. A very old, very rare, very specific object that had survived something. Under the label on the wall, in clean sans serif type, preserved, not forgotten. Raymond Morrow and Walter Crane, 196-92024. Elias stood in front of it for a long time before the room filled with people. He was wearing a different jacket, not the work clothes, not something expensive, just a clean dark jacket that fit. Vivienne stood nearby but not beside him, giving him the room he needed. The morning light moved across the car's surface in a way that the parking lot at Hartfield had never allowed. And in that light the original color was visible everywhere, not bright, not restored, but genuinely present, the color of something that has decided to stay. He thought about his father's hands on this same steering wheel. He thought about the specific way Raymond had driven, one hand low on the wheel, the other resting on the window frame in good weather, never in a hurry in a car that everyone else thought should be hurrying, because that was the only polite thing it could do for the vehicles around it. He thought about Raymond at the storage unit, all those years, paying the monthly fee out of a wage that did not easily support monthly fees, never explaining why, never needing anyone to understand it. He thought about Walter Crane in a factory room somewhere in Detroit, pressing a stamp into metal and believing, for at least that moment, that what he was building was worth building, not because anyone would remember, not because there was a reward at the end, but because the work itself demanded it. He thought about all the ways a thing can be made invisible by time, by neglect, by the loud confident certainty of people who have decided they already know what matters, and how sometimes, against all reasonable expectation, invisibility is not the same as disappearance. Vivienne came to stand beside him eventually. The room was beginning to fill, murmurs of conversation rising around them in the way of any public gathering. She looked at the car. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Not selling." He took a moment, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wanted to give it its proper weight. His mother's bills had not disappeared. His apartment was still the same apartment. The Hartfield garage had in a decision that Gerald had clearly agonized over, and arrived at for the wrong reasons, offered him a position in their documentation department, which was a more dignified title for the same building and a different kind of work, and he had taken it because it paid more, and because dignity, even when offered for impure reasons, is still dignity. None of that had changed. None of it was resolved by a car in a museum, but he was here, in this room, and the car was here, and the name on the wall was his father's name, and that was a thing that was real and could not be undone. He looked at the plaque one more time. Raymond Morrow and Walter Crane, two men who had believed in something without needing anyone else to confirm that it was worth believing in. Two men who had carried things quietly and without complaint and had not let go. Some things, he said, are not built to be scrapped. He looked at the Dodge one more time, its lines, its presence, the quiet authority of something that has outlasted every opinion ever expressed about it. My father knew that. He just needed someone else to figure it out eventually. Outside, the morning was becoming the day it was going to be. Traffic moved on the street beyond the museum windows, and the city made its familiar sounds, and the world continued with its ordinary urgency. But in this room, in this particular light, there was a thing that had been made with care a long time ago by someone who believed in what he was building, and it was still here, and it had a name on the wall, and the man who had carried it forward through 15 years of parking lots and mockery and modest living stood in front of it in a clean jacket, and felt for the first time in a long time that his father had known exactly what he was doing. Some things do not need to be explained, they only need to be kept. And sometimes keeping quiet, stubborn, daily keeping is the whole story, and enough.